Tonight we are very fortunate to hear from J. Baird Callicott. He is University Distinguished Research Professor of Philosophy and formerly the Regents Professor of Philosophy at the University of North Texas. Callicott is co-editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia of Environmental Ethics and Philosophy, and he is the author or editor of a score of books and dozens of journal articles, encyclopedia entries, and book chapters in environmental philosophy and ethics. He has served the International Society for Environmental Ethics as president and Yale University as the bioethicist in residence, and he has served the UNT Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies as chair. His research goes forward simultaneously on four main fronts: theoretical environmental ethics, comparative environmental ethics and philosophy, the philosophy of ecology and conservation policy, and biocomplexity in the environment, coupled natural and human systems, which is sponsored by the National Science Foundation. Callicott is perhaps best known as the leading contemporary exponent of Aldo Leopold's land ethic, and is currently exploring an Aldo Leopold earth ethic in response to global climate change. He taught the world's first course in environmental ethics in 1971 at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, my home state. His teaching at UNT includes graduate and undergraduate courses in ancient Greek philosophy and ethical theory, in addition to environmental philosophy. Would you please join me in welcoming J. Baird Callicott?
Real pleasure to be here. It's my first time on the campus of Brigham Young University, though I have been to David Keller's campus across town, so I'm not entirely unfamiliar with the area. So I'd like to kind of give an overview of environmental ethics with an emphasis on the comparative environmental ethics from the point of view of religions. As it was mentioned, the first course in environmental ethics was taught in 1971. The first papers appeared in 1973 and 1975. The Shallow and the Deep Long-Range Ecology Movements, a summary by Arne Næss, who was Norwegian. Is There a Need for a New and Environmental Ethic by Richard Routley, an Australian, and Is There an Ecological Ethics by Holmes Ralston III, who's an American. So you see this field sort of spontaneously generated on a global scale in the early or the first half of the 1970s. The first journal appeared in 1979, titled Environmental Ethics, edited by Eugene C. Hargrove, who's the founding and still current editor. So there's images of a few of those people. That's me back in the day. Arne Næss was a famous mountaineer as well as a distinguished philosopher. His nephew, by the name of, also named Arne Næss, was married to Diana Ross of the Supremes. I'm wondering about dinner conversations between those two, Richard Routley, Ralston, and Hargrove. So why did environmental ethics emerge just when it did? I think that mainly because of the environmental crisis of the 1960s. Oil spills on beaches. There was one tanker was very unfortunate to spill oil off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, and that stimulated the first environmental studies program developed there by Roderick Nash and his colleagues. Rivers were polluted with municipal and industrial waste. I can testify to that personally. I grew up in the shores of the Mississippi River in Memphis, Tennessee. There was indiscriminate use of pesticides, smog over big cities, especially Los Angeles and Houston. And then there was a crisis literature, which galvanized, I think, a popular sense that the environment was really in trouble. Silent Spring, of course, is probably the most famous by Rachel Carson, but Also, I think that the crisis name was given to it by Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of the Interior in the Kennedy administration, with his book, The Quiet Crisis. And this really, in calling it the quiet crisis, it provokes the question, what is the noisy crisis? And at that time, it was the threat of nuclear holocaust. So here we were having a comparison that this is a crisis as threatening as nuclear holocaust. Then there was unrest on college campuses, protest against the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and with that came a demand for relevancy in the classroom. I was teaching Plato and Aristotle, and students said, well, why are we I think that's very valuable to learn that stuff, but we want something that addresses our concerns as they are unfolding dramatically outside the halls of the university. And then, most significantly, photos of a beautiful planet Earth taken by Apollo 8, 10, and 11 astronauts from the moon. And by the way, in those days, people would say, oh, we're spending too much time on these silly adventures in outer space. We ought to be devoting that money to the problems of the inner city. And being a contrarian, I always said, oh, no, that money it's worth every penny just to get those photographs so that for the first time we could see our Earth as this gem in a desert, really, of space. As a response, the first National Earth Day came in 1970. It was sponsored by a senator from Wisconsin, and I was on a college campus in Wisconsin which focused on natural resources. And so it was an amazing event. From 8 o'clock in the morning until midnight, speaker after speaker addressed a packed gymnasium, pouring out their feelings and their ideas about the environmental crisis. And the next week, some of us got together and we wanted to organize an environmental studies program, and I raised my hand and I said, well, maybe I could teach environmental ethics. I had no idea what that would be. And so the problem was, of course, to gather enough literature to make a decent course and figure it all out. So there are a few images of the illustrating those things. Now, I think that the agenda-setting seminal text of environmental ethics was an essay that was published in Science in 1967 by Lynn White Jr. called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. It was printed in virtually every hastily assembled environmental anthology throughout the next several decades and is still a classic in the field. So White's argument was basically this, that the obvious point, modern technology is the cause of our environmental crisis. He points out that technology is as old as humanity. Flaked stone, sharpened stick spears, bows and arrows, all of these are technologies. What makes modern technology modern is that it's informed by science, which was previously pursued by a kind of aristocracy who didn't want to get their hands dirty, knowledge for knowledge's sake, which really begins in the 18th century. And aggressive technology in the scientific revolution, he points out, White, emerged in Christendom in Western Europe in the late Middle Ages. Lynn White Jr. was basically a historian of technology with a focus on the Middle Ages. So this was sort of in his wheelhouse. And then he went on to argue that the Judeo-Christian worldview set out in the Holy Bible was the worldview, the context of which in both science and technology and aggressive technology emerged in the West. And therefore, he concluded, the historical roots of our ecological crisis are traceable to the Judeo-Christian biblical worldview. So, what is that worldview? The big picture, we might say, is set out in Genesis, and it goes something like this. God creates the world in the course of 6 days. On day 1, light, day and night are created. Day 2, the firmament, which seems to be an opening between heaven and earth. Day 3, dry land and seas and plants, grass, herbs, and trees. Day 4, the sun, moon, stars, planets, days, seasons, etc. Day 5, animals, fish, fowl, whales, cattle, creeping things, beasts. Day 6, man. And this is the crucial text then, Genesis 1:26 through 28. Human beings, man is to have dominion over the animals, both male and female, created in the image of God. God commands them to be fruitful and multiply, to replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over every living thing. And so here we have, an image of God creating Adam in his own image and so on. So how then did the Judeo-Christian worldview inspire aggressive technologies? Christians, according to White, simply lived out this worldview and guided their behavior by their original and unnumbered commandment to have dominion over the creation and subdue it. And this obviously explains the development of aggressive technologies. White himself cites water-powered mills, the iron mold board plow, and so on, which tore into the body of the earth. Now, it may be a little bit less clear how the Judeo-Christian worldview might have inspired science, because we usually today think of science and religion at tension with one another. But the image of God, I think, explains the possibility and motivation for scientific knowledge. If God is the designer and artificer of nature, and we are created in his image, then we should be able to discover the design principles God used to create nature. Newton described himself not as a scientist, but as a natural theologian, thinking God's thoughts after him. That's a direct quotation. So basically, in our language today, the scientists of the 17th and 18th century set out to reverse engineer God's great machine. So White then blames the Judeo-Christian worldview for the environmental crisis, and blame is his word. He says, modern science-driven technology has given us, of course, many wonderful things, but it has also had serious environmental side effects. If so, Christianity, he says, bears a huge burden of guilt. The Judeo-Christian worldview replaced nature-worshiping old-world paganism. Christianity, he says, is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. He goes on to say we are superior to nature, contemptuous of it, willing to use it for our slightest whim. And then he says more science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecological crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. How then does White's famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, essay set the agenda for a future environmental philosophy? His critique of the Judeo-Christian tradition, I'll get into a response to it in a moment, is really both lurid and cavalier. But there's a more general subtext that's repeated again and again as a kind of refrain in this article. He says, "What shall we do? No one yet knows unless we think about fundamentals. Our specific measures may produce backlashes. What people do about their ecology or environment depends on what they think about themselves in relation to the things around them. What we do about ecology depends on our ideas of the man-nature relationship. We must rethink and refill our nature and destiny." So, whose professional job is it to think about fundamentals? Philosophers. That's who. In the early 1970s, White made some of us philosophers feel like only we could save the world from a worsening environmental crisis. I know that that sounds ridiculous, but there was a sense of mission there, because to do anything effective, he thought or claimed, about it depended on first thinking about the man-nature relationship, or so he insisted. So here was the agenda for a future environmental philosophy. One, critique our inherited ideas about human nature, nature, and the human-nature relationship. And not all of these inherited ideas are biblical. What about ancient Greek philosophy, Plato's otherworldliness and theory of forms? What about Cartesian dualism, the idea that we human beings are basically a ghost in a machine, and that the world itself is just an inert mechanical plenum? Newtonian mechanism, Lockean ideas of private property. There's just a wealth of ideas that we've inherited from the past, which, seen through the lens of the environmental crisis, suddenly become problematic. And then the second moment of a future environmental philosophy is to think up new, better, more environment-friendly ideas about these central themes: nature, human nature, and the relationship between them. So White then presented environmentally concerned Christians and Jews with a pretty sticky dilemma. You could either abandon your religious beliefs or abandon your environmental concerns, because he presented them as totally incompatible. So as a result, theologians went immediately to work their way through the horns of this dilemma, following up on White's suggestion to rethink our old religion. White himself made a stab at that by nominating St. Francis of Assisi as the patron saint of ecologists, which, interestingly, Pope John Paul actually did in 1979. According to White, Francis tried to depose man from his monarchy over creation and set up a democracy of all creatures. The more powerful response, however, from Christian and Jewish environmental thinkers was to challenge White's interpretation of Genesis 1. Think about it. First, after his day's creation work on days 3, 4, and 5, God saw what he created was good: moon, planets, and stars, plants, and animals. That could be interpreted as God conferring what environmental philosophers call intrinsic value on the creation. It has more than use value to human beings. Second, being created in the image of God entails responsibilities as well as privileges. We humans are entitled to use nature, yes, but not for our slightest whim, as White had suggested, nor certainly in ways that destroy or disfigure nature. Third, what does it mean to have dominion over the creation? It's kind of an odd word. Dominion basically means rule or governance, but there's a difference between despotic rule and a beneficent rule. The creation remains God's, not man's, so the kind of rule that God intended was that of a steward or caretaker of a lord's household and property. Trying to relate this to contemporary literature, you can think Carson the Butler on Downton Abbey as your current example of stewardship in the classic way. This steward interpretation of dominion is confirmed by Genesis 2:15, where we find God putting Adam, the first man, into the Garden of Eden to dress and keep it. Fourth, there are a few things we might have to put under the rug. We simply ignore the part of God's commandment that enjoins man not only to replenish the earth, but also to subdue it. I don't think they've come up with a positive interpretation of that. So the Judeo-Christian stewardship environmental ethic is theoretically elegant, and it is eminently practicable. It solves the central and gnarly theoretical problem of environmental ethics, the intrinsic value of nature, just by divine fiat. God declares creation to be good, period. It solves the problem of reciprocity. Why should we be nice to nature if nature is not nice back to us? And it's not. It's indifferent. Nature and all its creatures have no moral responsibility to us. The image of God solves that problem. We're created in it, and they're not. So we have moral responsibility to them, but they have none to us. And thirdly, and this most importantly, it's holistic. It's clear that when God is creating plants and animals and declaring them to be good, he's creating species, not specimens. So we don't have to get into animal liberation and animal rights. We can, in good conscience, kill and eat other creatures as long as we preserve and replenish their species or their kinds, as the Bible puts it. Now, the problem with the Judeo-Christian stewardship environmental ethic is that it's embedded in the Judeo-Christian worldview. It requires subscribers to believe in God as portrayed in the Bible, believe that God created the world, believe that man is created in the image of God. Now, there are a lot of people that believe that, but there are a lot of people that don't. The Judeo-Christian worldview is not consistent with the contemporary scientific worldview, in which the Earth is a planet, not the center of the universe. The cosmos took shape over many eons, not in 6 days. Man is one of 6 species of great ape and has no privileged status, all from a scientific perspective. And not all religious people share the Judeo-Christian worldview. It's shared more or less by Muslims, but not by Buddhists, Hindus, Jains, Taoists, Confucians, etc. So we might say that this is a great environmental ethic. As I say, intellectually elegant, eminently practicable, but parochial. It's, you consider the world's population, it doesn't appeal to everyone. So White then stimulated also what we call comparative environmental philosophy. Before suggesting a way to rethink our old religion by adopting St. Francis of Assisi's theology, White hinted at what it might mean to find a new religion. He says the beatniks, they were predecessors of the hippies, who are the basic revolutionaries of our time, show a sound instinct in their affinity for Zen Buddhism, which conceives of the man-nature relationship as very nearly the mirror image of the Christian view. There soon followed then essays like Tao Now by Houston Smith. But White himself rejected the prospect of finding a new religion and everyone converting to Taoism or Zen Buddhism because, quote, Zen and Taoism and Hinduism and Confucianism, however, is as deeply conditioned by Asian history as Christianity is by the experience of the West, and I am dubious of its viability among us. But who is us, Kimosabe? White assumed his audience to be limited to those conditioned by Western history. But the environmental crisis is global in scope. If Christian thinkers could tease a coherent and powerful environmental ethic out of the Judeo-Christian worldview for Christians, Jews and Muslims, of course, then might not thinkers in other religious traditions tease a coherent and powerful environmental ethics out of their worldviews for their various communities of faith? So, about a decade later, comparative environmental philosophy came on the scene, and it happened sort of this way. I got a fellowship to an NEH-sponsored 6-week summer institute for comparative philosophy at the University of Hawaii in 1984. Living in Wisconsin, what attracted me to this institute was not that it was on comparative philosophy, but that it was in Hawaii, and I could spend 6 weeks there. So not being all that enthusiastic about all of these Asian philosophies, I convinced key institute faculty that they had much to contribute to the new field of environmental philosophy. So we organized a series of sessions at the American Philosophical Association, the American Academy of Religion, on the theme Conceptual Resources in Environmental Ethics in Asian Traditions of Thought. and published some of the conference papers in special issues of Philosophy East and West and Environmental Ethics. The best of those papers were collected in a volume titled Nature and Asian Traditions of Thought that I edited with Roger Ames. And those are the sections of the book that was published by State University of New York Press. Building on the foundations provided by Nature and Asian Traditions of Thought and my previous work in American Indian environmental ethics, I undertook a global survey of the potential for ecological ethics in the principal world religions and select indigenous traditions in a work titled Earth's Insights, which was published in 1994 by the University of California Press and has had longer legs than I really thought it was. It recently has been translated in French, Japanese, and currently Spanish. The Spanish version isn't out yet. There are the chapter titles, South Asian traditions, East Asian, American Indian, South American, African, Australian, and so forth and so on. It's a genuinely global survey. I was first thinking about calling it a Cook's Tour of global environmental ethics. The old Cook's Tour went something like this. This is Thursday, so we must be in Rome. This is chapter 6, so we must be in India. But I got talked out of that as being a little too cynical. So that's what the book looks like. I have no idea what the Japanese version is. Comparative environmental philosophy matured in the 1990s. The Harvard Center for the Study of World Religions held a series of 10 conferences organized by Mary Evelyn Tucker on religion and ecology. I just want you to think about this. In the course of 3 years, this woman, wonderful, talented person, organized 10 conferences on a global scale in 3 years, and inviting leading thinkers in major world communities of faith to construct an environmental ethic from the conceptual resources of their religious worldviews. And then Harvard University Press published the fruits of those conferences in a series titled Religions of the World and Ecology. And there they are, so you see Buddhism and ecology, Confucianism and ecology, Christianity and ecology, Hinduism and ecology, Taoism and ecology, and so on. Mary Evelyn Tucker herself comes out of a Catholic background, and so she herself is a member of a community of faith. So why comparative environmental philosophy? And now I'm calling him old Lynn White Jr., I think he's dead now, noted it is quite unlikely that we will all convert to Hinduism, Buddhism, or Taoism, that the West, Europe, or Neo-Europe, as one scholar calls it, will adopt one of these foreign worldviews. But as anyone who has traveled to West, South, or East Asia will attest, those people's cultures and civilizations could use an environmental ethic quite as much as the people's cultures and civilizations of the West. A Hindu environmental ethic is for Hindus, just as a Taoist environmental ethic is for Taoists, and so on for all the rest. We then confront what I call the one-many problem in Earth's Insights. The environmental crisis is global in scope. Many, if not most, of our environmental problems are transboundary, trespassing geographical boundaries, political boundaries, cultural boundaries, religious boundaries. All these religion-based environmental ethics are embedded in very different, mutually contradictory worldviews. God doesn't exist in Buddhism and Taoism. For Taoists, there is the impersonal Tao or way. For Buddhists, there is ultimately the holy sunyata or emptiness at the core of everything. All these religions are not just saying the same thing in different words. There is no common denominator of belief running through them all. I know that sometimes we like to think, well, they're all really saying the same thing, but they're not. But to be effective and successful, all of them have to work together in perfect harmony to meet the challenge of the environmental crisis. And my favorite example is the Siberian crane. Its migration route begins in shamanic Siberia near the Arctic Circle. It flies south through Islamic and Pakistan, and ultimately its breeding grounds are in Hindu India. Now, in order to create a coherent conservation program for the Siberian crane in terms of religious-based environmental ethics, you've got to be able to get everybody more or less on the same page. There is, however, a common international belief system that is as global in scope as the environmental crisis, and that's international science. Science may have originated in Western Christendom, as White claims, though I think that would be disputed by other scholars, but it has now become thoroughly international. Scientists studying volcanoes in Beijing, New Delhi, Osaka, Berkeley, Lisbon, Mexico City, anywhere in the world share a single worldview, a single epistemology, the scientific method, a single set of criteria for distinguishing good from bad science, and communicate with one another around the world in a common language, mathematics and English, by means of international conferences, peer-reviewed journals, and increasingly via the internet. As I'm fond of saying, we can instantly tell the difference between Hollywood and Bollywood cinema, but volcanology, no matter where it happens, in what cultural context it's generated, is volcanology. So I would like to suggest then that the international cross-cultural scientific worldview is privileged. And science tells us a new story about the nature of nature, human nature, and the relationship between humans and nature. I want to emphasize, by the way, that it's only a story among stories. It's like the story told in Genesis or in the Bhagavad Gita. It tells us about the origin and structure of the unimaginably vast and old universe, about the formation of the earth, about the evolution of life on earth, about the way life on earth works ecologically, about human evolution. The science story, I want to emphasize again, is just a story among other more ancient stories, but it is, I would want to claim, better than those others. And the reason it's a better story is because it's logically self-consistent, while the others sometimes are not. It comprehends all the known facts of observation, collected with telescopes, microscopes, magnetic resonance imaging, and so forth. And most importantly, it's self-correcting, always in a process of revision and re-editing as new facts, we call it data, are discovered. So there is an environmental ethic which is actually based in the scientific worldview, and it's the evolutionary, ecological, as I call it, land ethic of Aldo Leopold. Leopold writes, "All ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. Ecology simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. A land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such." And the summary moral maxim, the golden rule of the land ethic is, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Now, I have suggested in my book, Earth's Insights, that the Leopold land ethic can serve as a kind of Rosetta Stone, a means of translating one parochial, religion-based ethic into another, a kind of clearinghouse for them all. It can be the arbiter when their indications are in conflict. And moreover, science can validate the ecological insights that are so well represented in indigenous traditions of thought that we now call it by an acronym, TKE, Traditional Ecological Knowledge. The language of science is abstract, mathematical, and inaccessible to most lay persons. The language of traditional religion is vivid, concrete, and metaphorical. Thus, religious vocabulary, imagery, and parable can help tell the new science story and the moral of that story, the evolutionary ecological land ethic, to the general public. And let me just give you an example from Leopold. The land ethic is probably the most famous of his essays in the Sand County Almanac. The second most famous is called Thinking Like a Mountain. And in Thinking Like a Mountain, Leopold tells a story about killing a wolf in 1909. It's recently been discovered exactly the place. There's a new film called The Green Fire, and Leopold says, I reached the old wolf in time to see a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I knew then that there was something unknown to me that only she and the mountain comprehended. Since then, of course, now, what this really is, it's a parable, and it's a parable that is a kind of reflection or imitation of the story of Paul on the road to Damascus. Paul heard a voice. Leopold hears the howl of the wolf. Paul saw a light. Leopold sees the fierce green fire. And Paul converted from a persecutor of Christians to an apostle of Jesus. Leopold converts from a persecutor of predators, and he was a persecutor of predators, to a protector and a defender of predators. So here we see Leopold, and this is not the only example. His language is drawn constantly from the Bible, expressing a very different worldview. And here, the pivotal moment in Sand County Almanac is similar to a pivotal moment in the New Testament. Aldo Leopold also sensed that there was an untapped spirituality latent in science. And this is what I think many of us think of. Science is just dry and it's boring and it's valueless and it lacks spirituality. But I think Leopold senses that there is a potential for spirituality in religion. He says it is a century now since Darwin gave us the first glimpse of the origin of species. We know now what was unknown to all the preceding caravan of generations, that men are only fellow voyagers with other creatures in the odyssey of evolution. This new knowledge should have given us by this time a sense of kinship with other creatures, a wish to live and let live, a sense of wonder over the magnitude and duration of the biotic enterprise. Right now I'm reading a book, I brought it with me, by Lynn Margulis called A Symbiotic Earth. And it's the story of the vast majority of the history of life on Earth was microbial, essentially. We have a very limited view of what life is in these latter days. When you read that, you get a genuine sense of wonder over the magnitude and duration of the biotic enterprise, going back 3.5 billion years. That the evolutionary process has no goal or direction or any exalted place in it for Homo sapiens is no cause for despair. Rather, we should exult in our good fortune and take pride in being the most recent experiment in a process that began 3.5 billion years ago. This little explored religious potential of science has been that Leopold intuits and expresses in a kind of subtle and incipient way, has now surfaced in a more formal way. Catholic theologian Thomas Berry teamed up with physicist Brian Swimme to write a new universe story, which they honestly present as an alternative to the Genesis story, expanding Leopold's spiritual reflections on evolution and ecology from planetary to cosmic proportions. This has now been turned into a documentary, PBS quality documentary. Brian Swimme teamed up with Mary Evelyn Tucker, whom I mentioned before, to produce a documentary telling the new origin story of science with talking head on-screen narration by Brian Swimme with graphics and special effects, so you see stars coming into being and that kind of thing. So here's my conclusion. Lynn White Jr. stimulated the development of religion-based environmental ethics with his critique of the environmental implications of the Judeo-Christian biblical worldview. Judeo-Christian apologists responded with the intellectually elegant and powerful Judeo-Christian stewardship environmental ethic. White also suggested that there might be the potential for environmental ethics in Zen Buddhism, which stimulated the development of environmental ethics in Buddhism and many other Asian traditions of thought. Religious pluralism and environmental ethics might be unified by making a Rosetta Stone out of the science-based land ethic of Aldo Leopold. And the science-based Leopold land ethic is itself one among many religious environmental ethics because there is a spiritual potential in science that he tapped into and that has been explored by Berry and others. So that's all, folks, but I do want you to stay tuned for a new book titled Environmental Philosophy and Asian Traditions of Thought. It's edited by me and Jim McRae, and it's forthcoming from SUNY Press. I'm just writing the afterword in my spare time at the conference here. So thank you for your attention.